So now we'll look at debt to GDP. You have the 1990s, debt to GDP debt was growing at about 3 times as quick as GDP. 2006, we had debt growing 5 times as fast as GDP. This was consumer fueled debt and businesses taking on debt and growing, and GDP was growing at the same time. However, I want to look at this last little bit. From 2007 to 2013, most of that debt, the majority, has come from the government taking on debt. We haven't seen consumers borrowing. Business borrowing hasn't been that high either. We've seen a lot of businesses are actually sitting on cash. So this GDP growth, again, has been fueled by, I would argue, potentially government debt. So as I talked about savings a little earlier, with the giant levels of debt and not saving enough, we've had workers. The top line is workers aged 55 to 69, and the bottom is workers 54 and under. So this shows that I think a lot of workers after the recession realized that they didn't have enough money to retire. So when you don't have enough money to retire, you keep working, and you're not going to take on more debt because you're already debt burdened. You want to save, you want to make yourself comfortable for retirement, because you need about a savings rate of around 7% to maintain your standard of living into retirement. It's estimated. So this just kind of shows that we have people sticking around in the labor force longer, potentially not being able to retire because they haven't saved enough, because we have a society that's fueled via consumption, and we're all encouraged to spend, spend, spend. So you hear from the Fed, you hear from the government, don't be afraid to go out and spend money. However, you kind of have to look out for yourself sometimes and save some money. So now I'm going to talk about monetary policy. Monetary policy has been very accommodative recently. This is a quote from the 2013 FOMC statement. Feel free to read it. I'm going to tell you some of what the Fed has done. Since December of 2008, the Fed funds rate has been at 0. So it's been at 0 bound for nearly 5 years. At the same time, the balance sheet of the Fed through quantitative easing programs has grown by $3 trillion from a balance sheet of $1 trillion to $4 trillion. They've also used forward guidance communication to try to kind of spur the economy and tell people we're doing all that we can. The Fed's credible. We are going to see economic growth. So what do we see here? I want to walk you through this graph. This red is zero interest rate policy. It's been at floor for 5 years. The green line is a 10-year U.S. Treasury rate, and the blue is the S&P. This chunk is quantitative easing 1, QE 2, Operation Twist, and that is our recent quantitative easing 3. So what has happened during these times of quantitative easing? The Fed goes, we're going to purchase treasuries or mortgage-backed securities, and we're going to push down borrowing rates so that we fuel the economy, so that we can see economic growth that we also need. But what has happened was, one hypothesis is that investors were like, hey, the Fed's going all out. They're going to really save the economy. If the economy recovers, the S&P is going to be valued at way more than 666 as it was in March of 2009. So what happened was the first program, it went from 666 to 1217. It almost doubled. What happened when it ended? Oh, well, first let me show you what happened to borrowing rates. Borrowing rates went from about 2% on the 10-year. This is the risk-free rate, U.S. Treasury 10-year rate. It doubled as well. It went from 2% to 4%. Because investors at this point were in bonds, risk-free assets, because they were nervous that the economy was collapsing. So they wanted to get the yield, that safe yield that they could. But when the Fed said that the economy is going to recover, they jumped into the stock market. So since the Fed even currently only buys 15% of the bond market monthly, that investors were able to push up the S&P, and as a result, borrowing costs increased. But when QE ended, look what happened. What the Fed wanted, borrowing rates dropped. Wasn't that supposed to lead to a healthy economy? And then the S&P also dropped off. So they're like, oh no, the S&P can't drop. The economy has to be healthier. The economy's not healthy. Let's do another round of quantitative easing. Same thing happened. And then we did Operation Twist, which wasn't as successful because it wasn't outright purchases. It was balance sheet neutral, which means they bought long-term treasuries and sold short-term to flatten the yield curve. But the yellow is the most recent, and it shows that it was at about 1.43 10-year treasury yield before they markets anticipated this, and now they're currently up at 2.79. I thought the intention of the Fed was to borrow, was really to stimulate the economy, the dual mandate, stable inflation, and maximum employment. However, one of the transmission mechanisms they wanted to do this was through the lending channel, lowering rates, which has not been effective, and all it has done is spurred confidence and potentially overconfidence in the markets. And overconfidence in the Fed, they have the ability to have us grow at this normalized rate. And this is, again, Fed projections. The top line, January 2011 was a meeting. Each meeting, they come out with projections. This is on real GDP. They projected 2011 to be 3.7%, 2012 to be 3.95%, and 2013 to be 4%. Look at what actually happened. They were off by about 50% each time. 2011 growth, 1.7, 2012 growth, 1.8, and currently we're just over 2% in 2013. So we're growing, but we also have the most highly accommodative fiscal and monetary policies that we've ever seen that is pushing us around slowly and not getting to normal growth. And this just shows, again, a potential loss of the Federal Reserve credibility by having projections so high and not reaching them, and making the markets optimistic, because over time the Fed has been a credible institution that has been able to control inflation and output fairly well. But at the zero bound, it's not sure that they'll be able to do this. So this is troubling moving forward. And finally, I want to talk about the banking sector. So these are non-performing loans and reserves. The red line is reserves as a percentage of total loans. So this is how much the banks hold aside in case like loans go bad. As you can see, the blue line is non-performing loans as percentage of total loans. So those, people who are late on payments and non-accrual status, and potentially shows that during the crisis, obviously people started defaulting on their loans. So non-performing loans spiked to about 8%. We've seen some good since then. It's down to nearly about 5%. But what has happened to reserves? This tight line, reserves used to be about 80% of non-performing loans. It's at about 8% right now. So that correlation is huge. So if we accidentally see people's default trend start to grow, we would need to impact our reserves by throwing way more reserves in, and this would hurt banks' earnings. The reason they're cutting reserves is because they see a healthier banking system, healthier loan book, which is the bank is becoming healthier. Loans are non-performing loans are declining, but they're not at this level yet. So I think they're prematurely taking away reserves to kind of bolster their earnings. I'm almost done, John. Total interest expense. This is another way that the banks have been growing. Since 2007, the bank's interest expense, so this is their main cost. This is how a bank works. I'm a bank. Patrick gives me money. I pay him for the deposit. But since interest rates are at rock bottom, their cost, the main cost of their business has been slashed by over 80%. So as I talked about earlier, they don't have control over this, over the interest rates. That's the Fed. But at the same time, you need to be able to grow at a sustainable rate. So we've seen banks, financials really doing very well. But this is very low right now, this amount of expense. They don't have much more room to cut their expenses to continue this trend. At the same time, this is their interest income. This is their revenues. Their revenues have also been declining, but not as drastically. And the reason for this, I see it continued, is loans that were made back then, a lot of times when you give a deposit, not many people do CDs anymore. If you're gonna, go for a risk-free asset, you're gonna go more towards, if you're gonna invest in U.S. Treasuries or maybe, invest in equities, why not? So the expenses drop quickly. However, when banks lend money, they usually do it for 10, 15, 20, 30-year periods, where with each payment, less is going towards interest and more of that money is going towards principal. So I would see that this continues to fall unless they do a couple of things. They can either go into securities a little, make themselves a little more inherently risky. They can also increase their lending by finding people who are willing to borrow. However, as I talked about earlier, a lot of people have part-time jobs. A lot of people don't have a steady income. And after the bank just got burned, they don't want to lend to people who have a part-time job who could be let go like that. They want, steady borrowers. So they either have to lend to more risky people, or they need to get into more risky assets, or they continue to cut reserves to reach this continued expected earnings growth. Or as you see Barclays recently did, was their non-interest expense. So the workers at banks, they've been slicing those out too to kind of cut that expense so they can continue to have that bottom earnings growth continue. And this is showing the loans and leases in banks. So since 2007, the total amounts of loans and leases haven't grown because we don't have that borrowing demand. You need to have people who are willing to borrow so that the banks can make money. It has grown, but it's still not at its peak, and it's rather flat since 2007. So for those reasons I just mentioned, they really haven't been able to loan out much money. And then this, just again, is reserves as percentage of assets. The reserves has fallen by about from like 2% to near 1%, and as a result, we've seen profits as a percentage of assets rise as well. And just in conclusion, this is, I don't want you guys to look at this and take this literally. This shows the historical economic recoveries, and on average is 39 months. So this is definitely biased. You can take out, we're in a completely new time period. I'm 100% that historical performance does not guarantee future results. So yeah, even if you go from the 30s onward, the average recovery time periods are greater. However, I'm going to say Johnny Dimon, or the CEO of JP Morgan, said after the financial crisis that we need to be prepared every 5 to 7 years for serious crisis to occur, some type of shock, and we need to be prepared. So kind of like what I'm asking is, are we prepared right now currently for some type of shock? Is our economy healthy enough to absorb some type of shock? And kind of currently, is the market valued at its correct position? And is what we're doing sustainable? So I'm going to open it up now to you guys for some questions. Hope you learned a little bit. And I'm not saying that doom and gloom is inevitable, but just kind of think when you strategize going forward with investment portfolios, kind of looking at these different things domestically and how they kind of shape up. John.
So the Fed's target is 0% going forward, Fed funds rate.
Mm-hmm.
They're tapering off QE3. Employment's dropping pretty quickly down to the Fed's target level. Like you said, companies are flush with cash. A lot of people are saying that they're going to use that cash to do stock buybacks, which honestly I'm in agreement with you, probably more so than that's not going to float the economy. But if those things play out, what do you see as the biggest single threat to the economy as is? I think you're right. I think earnings expectations went up drastically, but I think if we meet those expectations, which is all indicators are pointing to, yes, the economy is doing well. Yes, companies are going to earn significantly higher profits that perhaps justify those valuations. So what do you think is the single biggest threat to that?
I have a couple of things to say. I wouldn't say that all economic indicators are positive. I'd say a lot of them show stagnation, that we are not able to grow. We're still relying on a lot of government assistance. If you take that away, that's a huge problem. So we're running reigning deficits year after year.
That's classic. That's Keynesian economics, right? You spend through the recession and then you recover. So
yeah, but we've been spending. We're not in a recession. Why do we? My thing is, if the economy isn't growing at 5.5%, can we force it there? Do we have the tools to make it go there? That's what it's relying upon. Our current spending habits are actually very dangerous if you go and we don't reach that 5.5%. If we do slip in another recession, if something bad happens, the fiscal policy isn't going to be there like it was last time. We're not going to have that as a floor to kind of help people out as far as actually being able to survive, let alone bolster consumption. So I would argue that Keynesian economics is kind of flawed in some aspects as far as you're arguing that you can just spend and create money, but this is infinite. When do you have surpluses? We have no surpluses. Even when we grow at 5.5%, their projections, we still have a $500 billion deficit. So when, is it just exponential borrowing forever?
I agree, and I think that it's stickier to try and take those spending away than it is to implement them in the first place, which is more of a political question than, politics messing with economics. But if you look back at Greenspan in the end of the 90s, it was, he popped the asset bubble too early. And if you look at Janet Yellen, she's more dovish than that. She doesn't believe in asset bubbles. She published a paper that says asset bubbles don't exist. So if you take that into consideration, you look at the Fed's policy saying 0% Fed fund rates going forward, I think they learned from Greenspan's mistake, and they're not going to pull the cord early. I think they're just going to taper through this, and what's.
I mean, my question goes, where do you get the consumption moving forward? Where do you find our economy growing? Because our middle class is not vibrant.
Unemployment's down to 6.6.
Yeah, but as you saw, our median incomes are falling. Our amount of money to actually use to consume is falling, and that's with all those government transfer payments propping things up. So you don't have healthy organic growth. You have a lot of people working part-time. Yeah, unemployment's at 6.6. That's one, I would argue, a very silly indication of our labor market. It doesn't show our health. I'd say that our employment population ratio, the amount of wages people are earning, and our consumption class, those who are actually responsible to consume, how much money are they making? They're not making much. And actually, a lot of them are still over indebted. They owe money that they need to pay off before they retire. So how are they going to be able to continue to consume more? That's kind of my question back. I don't see a possible way, and it's kind of scary.
So you're saying, what if you had to put a probability on it? What's your prediction for a recession or a slowdown within the next year?
That's putting a timing on something that I think a lot of people, things can continue on this slow growth pattern for a while, but eventually we're going to see that that we can't grow at 5.5%, or 6%. That is just seeing things were done back a certain way in the past, and we're in a wholly new economic environment with different technology. We have different demographics. We have a globalized world as we've never seen, and these are all leading to cost cutting. Why would I, as a business, I'm going to continue to cut my costs, and eventually, if the consumers don't have enough money, what's going to have to happen? If they don't have enough money to buy my goods, prices are going to fall, assets are going to fall. So if this trend continues, it will lead to deflation.
Do you see anything positive in the future? Like I agree with you on everything that you've said so far.
I do.
What's positive?
I think that if we can change things in a certain way, that productivity gains, that we can continue to produce more with little effort, so that, and if people learn, if they want to increase their standard of living, and they get educated, and because the time of the unskilled labor is finished. I think that's the major thing that's causing a lot of these job slashings. You no longer have somebody sitting there in an assembly line putting a machine together, as was done throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. You have a lot of that labor being outsourced, and now it's actually coming back here in forms of automation, because why would you pay all those transportation fees if you can get it done here? But all that money, as I'm saying, is being funneled to the top, to the very few people, when those on the bottom aren't making anything. And even, like, I'd say the bottom 50% are struggling to get by, living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have a savings. So I could see that, if you continue to tax that top group and they can make enough money where it doesn't matter, and, give it off to the others to maintain a decent standard of living, that's probably the best case scenario, and having slow growth into the future. But why do we need to grow by 5.56%? I don't see why that is necessary. You can have a correction. It's not going to definitely be the end of the world, especially for those on top. Those on bottom are the ones that are going to be affected more, but they've already been affected. They're out of jobs. They need to develop a new skill to get back in the labor force. And right now, through government transfer payments, it's kind of slowing that down. They're like, well, I wasn't making that much money in the first place. Now the government's supporting me. I have no incentive. And the socioeconomic culture in that area is much different. A lot of those people are very big in drugs, alcohol, that bottom 20%, and living in ghettos and whatnot. So they don't really have much incentive to grow. But if we could revamp our education system and have people like you who are ready and amped to learn, hopefully, not just make a ton of money, I would like to think, then if we advance our education and people learn how to do things like work on machines, then we can increase our productivity and have jobs for more people. But it takes time. Could take a generation. I'll come back.
Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm trying to tie this back to, I guess, all the members in the group now. Looking at stocks, you see like record valuations, stuff we really haven't seen before. And, like John said, that they do meet our expectations as the earnings come out. So, kind of tying it back, do we kind of adjust our expectations for these things, or is it a bubble? And not speaking to a sector in specific, but like, is, when I look at something and I say, wow, that PE, I've never seen that before, do I say to myself, well, this is the norm now, or do I say it might be a bubble on the rise?
Well, about the first part, how have we been hitting these earnings growth I've talked about? We're cost cutting. We don't have the sales growth, the revenue, for a sustainable growth business plan, or sustainable and never-ending growth. We need to have revenues rising. Once we see revenues rising at a pretty stable level that is consistent with earnings, and we're investing in our own companies, yes, you know what, I could be wrong. That could happen, but until I see that trend, until I see real median incomes rising in a middle class that's growing, I have a fear that, this trend is unsustainable. And will we get knocked down as far as the S&P goes? Potentially. I mean, there's a lot of risks in Europe still that have been brushed under the rug. Same with here, as I just mentioned, just by government spending, we've been able to kind of push our way out of it. And yeah, we're kind of reining these things in, and we'll see how this moves forward. But, recent job numbers have not been good. Seasonally adjusted, we had 114 people added to the labor force in January, 75,000 people in December. And that's seasonally adjusted. For, if you take that out, it was like we lost 2.5 million people in the labor force, which is a terrible indication for economic health. So that's why I'd argue that labor statistics, yeah, you can take some and say they're good and some and say they're bad, but there's no robust growth to say that we are definitely growing at a great level to justify all-time highs in stock prices. Last question.
So yeah, and I know the unemployment level, we can argue about the importance of that figure, but a lot of people do look at it as a key variable in the economy and the GDP growth. North Carolina last year cut their long-term unemployment benefits, which is something that the U.S. just did federally on Jan 1. North Carolina saw a drastic decrease in their unemployment rate. What are your thoughts on that going forward? Do you think the U.S. will see the same? We'll see the flood of these disenfranchised workers coming back and willing to take, lower wage jobs?
I mean, that would be ideal, but at the same time, you could see those same people, in states that their industries aren't growing as well as North Carolina, that certain area, and they're not going to be able to find jobs. So that income that they're receiving from unemployment is gone. Now they have less to consume. So yes, it could potentially force people to find jobs, but how much of a real difference is it going to make as far as that consumption goes, that consumption base kind of
Well, I think the economic incentive, if you had to draw it out, they would say the incentive now, because they eliminated the...
No, there is. There's
past
definitely
26 weeks, go get
an
a job.
incentive. But I'm saying, is there jobs for them? Are there people hiring at high enough wages?
Well, sure, if we're at 6.6% unemployment.
Well, I'm arguing that indication is definitely not a great variable of where we are in the economy. We have a lot of part-time jobs still. We have wages, the jobs are earning less. Our median income is declining. So we don't have higher paying jobs. These are a lot of times service providing jobs. If you look through the Bureau of Labor Statistics and their employment reports, they're not really very great jobs that we're producing. Our income levels aren't growing. So we need growing income levels to grow our economy, or we need debt to grow. Our debt channels are clogged. We're over indebted. At the same time, our government's been spending as much as they can. Or, maybe they could spend more, but let's go into murky waters.
I think that wages that you're talking about are more tied to inflation than GDP growth, right? I mean, it's more so a CPI adjustment each year than...
Yeah, that your
tied
real
to
standard
nominal
of living
GDP.
is still declining.
I think too, you should probably look into the U6 graph that he had up, because that really takes into consideration a lot more than just 6.6. People just look at 6.6 and say, oh, our unemployment's, decreasing and whatnot. We have to remember those that are actually dropping out of the workforce as well, because we all know how unemployment is calculated. And also in Davos, Switzerland recently, when they all got together, unemployment rates are a lot higher worldwide than what's being reported. But that's just because we have to report unemployment of what's at. And I think that U6 said right now unemployment should be, if you take into things realistically, it's around 12, 13%.
If you take out the drop in labor force participation rate, they're still at around 11%. So, you could argue about it. I'm not saying that we're going to have an infinite collapse, but I'd say best case scenario is slow growth into the future.
Very good presentation.
Thanks.